Hey YouTube, welcome to Monday's edition of The Breakfast Club. You're with Got That Funk. Thanks for joining me. I wanted to talk a little bit about what does or does not constitute a police state and ask the question, if we are not experiencing a police state in the USA at the moment, what's missing? What needs to happen that isn't happening or hasn't already happened? I don't really want to say in some sort of alarmist way that I think the USA is a police state, but I do want to question whether or not it is in the process of becoming one based on certain criteria, which I'm going to go into in a moment. But before I do that, let me just read what it says about a police state in the entry on Wikipedia. Police state is a term denoting a government that exercises power arbitrarily through the power of the police force. Originally, the term designated a state regulated by a civil administration, but since the beginning of the 20th century, the term has taken on an emotional and derogatory meaning by describing an undesirable state of living characterized by the overbearing presence of the civil authorities. The inhabitants of a police state may experience restrictions on their mobility or on their freedom to express or communicate political or other views, which are subject to police monitoring and enforcement. All right, so that's the Wikipedia entry on a police state. Now, the reason I wanted to read that, the reason I wanted to read that was because the overbearing presence of the civil authorities, I suppose that's a matter of opinion, and the USA being such a vast country, I'm sure it varies greatly from one region to another, how much people feel there's an overbearing presence of the police, and whether or not people think that the police in their area are heavy-handed as well. But there are parts of the country where there's a problem. I made a video about it some time ago on the original Breakfast Club channel called Policeteering, where, you know, local municipalities, basically, as part of their funding, they decide that they need to extract a certain amount of money through various different kinds of fines against the public. And so they pass like arbitrary laws, like, for example, you can't have a barbecue in your front yard, or you can't have a basketball hoop on the front of your house, that kind of thing. You know, and then they go around looking for people to bust, and they'll find these people, and they actually decide that, you know, when they're making their budget, they factor in how much they anticipate they're going to get from fines in a particular year. So the police have an incentive to go out and look for things to bust. You know, that's ass backwards. That's not how law and order is supposed to work, at least in my opinion. Anyway, and, you know, arbitrary laws like that, what's the point of restricting freedom to that degree? Seriously. I mean, you can make all kinds of arguments against that, which I'm not going to go with because it's really not the point of this video. Policeteering, though, is a problem, and that is one example of the overbearing presence of the police. Now, I'm going to link an article in the description box below, and I'm going to talk about it right now. There's a drive by certain Republican state legislatures. I think 18 states so far are drafting legislation to increase punishments against people who participate in protests which turn violent. And they want to, you know, if you participate in a protest which turns violent or that causes property damage, you will be subject to possibly asset forfeiture. Now, asset forfeiture is something that I've only recently become aware of in the past sort of year and a half. I didn't really know about this for quite a long time. But I mean, basically, the police can seize money or assets of yours, personal belongings, whatever they want to, if they think it might be the result of criminal activity. And they can just take it from you, and you have to prove that you have a legitimate reason to have been carrying that amount of money or that own this personal stuff. You know, you have to be able to justify how you paid for it or whatever before you can get it back. Otherwise, it's gone forever. They could just steal it from you. And I want you to look at this chart. This obviously is a few years old now, but back in 2014, asset forfeitures by the federal authorities accounted for more taking more from the people than actual burglaries did. And that's the federal authorities there in that chart. I think it must be an awfully lot bigger number if you put in state and local law enforcement asset forfeitures as well. The fact is that the cops can basically rob you and you've got no legal recourse. You have to prove yourself to be innocent of, not having that much money or whatever for some sort of nefarious purpose. Source, whatever. The point being is you have to prove yourself innocent, and they can just take it without any kind of due process. And you have to go through an ordeal to get your own stuff back. That is absolutely wrong, okay? So think about applying that on people who are at a protest who may or may not be involved in any kind of altercations of any kind, but because they're there at a protest, they might be subject to this kind of law enforcement. This is clear intimidation, and in the First Amendment to the Constitution, the last part of it is the right, Congress can't make any laws to abridge the right of people to peaceably assemble to ask the government to redress their grievances or whatever. And that's the First Amendment, all right? The right to protest, the right to peaceably assemble is guaranteed. And if a protest goes the wrong way, which sometimes can happen, I grant that for sure, you have to be very careful about how to attribute the blame, where these things start. I am not on anyone's side when it comes to this issue, because it can start from either side, or even people who aren't involved in a protest sometimes just come to protest because it's a good place to start a ruck. It happens. You get agents provocateur, both professional and amateur, who just come, to make a fuss. And I've seen that happen at a few protests in my own time. So, but like I say, you can't say, oh, the cops are always starting it, or the protesters are always going to start it, or whatever. It varies, and sometimes you get rival groups of protesters as well, which can have some pretty ugly results. Bottom line is, though, there's going to be plenty of people present who have nothing to do with any of that, who will be subject to these kinds of laws. Now, so far, none of these laws have actually passed. They're still in the drafting phases in some Republican legislatures around the country. But like I say, from my point of view, that is directly trying to intimidate and discourage people from protesting, which they have the absolute constitutional right to do. So that's a problem. Arizona is one of those 18 states who's looking into passing these kinds of laws, and in another article I'm going to link in the description box below, I see that Arizona is considering passing a law to require people who are passengers in a car, in a vehicle, to carry ID, and that the cops, if they pull that vehicle over, can demand the ID of the passenger as well as that of the driver. And from my point of view, that just seems like a clear violation of your rights. You shouldn't have to show your papers just because the cops decide to interfere with your day. Whether or not legitimately. I mean, if you're a passenger in a vehicle, unless they have some reasonable cause to suspect that you're guilty of something wrong, you shouldn't have to identify yourself at all. As long as you behave yourself and keep your mouth shut, they should leave you alone. Shouldn't they? And the interesting thing when I looked at the article is that the lawmakers who are considering putting this into play are doing so with the rationale that it's going to make things easier for the police. That's not what laws are supposed to be for. Things are supposed to be in the public interest. That's what legislation is supposed to be about. I can't see how it's in the public interest to basically have their Fourth Amendment rights violated. You're not supposed to be subjected to any unnecessary searches or seizures unless they have a reason to suspect you of a crime. What this is really about is, of course, Arizona is a border state, and Trump is cracking down on, trying to deport people and whatever. And he's trying to, the politicians in Arizona are trying to make it easier to basically question anybody who doesn't look right. It's totally going to open up a whole another avenue for profiling in Arizona. And, if Arizona does it, what's to stop other places from doing it? I think these kinds of laws are really dangerous. You shouldn't be restricting liberty to the point where the cops can just demand your papers because you're in a fucking car. Please. Please. If you're not driving the vehicle, you've got nothing to answer for. It blows my mind that the politicians seem to want to push this kind of thing through. I hope it doesn't pass. But whether it passes or not, it's an indication, again, of an overbearing presence by the police. And so I want to ask the question for the end of this video. You know, if we're not living in a police state, what's the tipping point? What's missing that isn't happening? You know, Trump is drafting the police in to mix them in with the, you know, ICE people, the immigration people. He's also wanting to call in the National Guard to do that. Trump has threatened Chicago with possibly declaring martial law if the violence there continues unabated. Stuff like this should be concerning to everybody. And, you know, we've all talked about during the Obama administration about how the police have been becoming increasingly militarized in terms of their kit and their equipment, the amount of ways that they can hurt you, and the lack of consequences many times for cops that do. So we have to ask these questions seriously and face up to the fact that we could accidentally drift into a police state if we're not already there. And like I say, if we're not already there, what's missing? Thanks for your comments down below. I look forward to a vigorous discussion. Sister Danger ought to be here for tomorrow's video on The Breakfast Club. I'll see you again next week. Until next time, may all your ups and downs be ups.